Hello and welcome to Tech Deal's Game Performance Review Laptop Graphics GTX 1060 6GB versus GTX 1070 8GB. Which one should you buy? This is going to be a look at two laptops that are otherwise exactly the same in basically all respects except for the graphics chip that's included. Linked in the video description below will be both of these laptops as well as several alternative choices with the same graphics chips. By and large, the performance is going to be the same regardless of which laptop you buy, so long as it has either the GTX 1060 6GB card versus the GTX 1070 8GB card. The two laptops that I'm testing today are identical in configuration except for the graphics chip. 1080p IPS displays, i7 6700HQ 6th generation 4-core 8-thread processors with a turbo speed of up to 3.5 GHz, 16 GB of DDR4 2133 RAM, solid-state drives, as well as hard drives. Today, I am testing the 6th generation version of these machines. The links in the description below will be to the 7th gen. What are the differences? Fairly minor. 300 MHz on the turbo clock speed and a minor RAM speed difference. So if you buy a 7th gen machine, they will be slightly faster than this, but honestly, it is not a large difference. The video you're watching was recorded using an external Elgato HD60S capture card. No performance loss due to recording, as the recording was done on a second computer. Fraps was used for the benchmark results you'll see at the end of the video, and MSI Afterburner is used for the real-time info at the top left corner of the screen. Today we are testing 7 different games on these laptops. We are using the built-in benchmarks of each of these games, otherwise it would be a 3-hour video. Now some of these games I've previously tested and shown gameplay footage. Other games I've never tested, so some of these results will be new, but all the results will be different because when I did The Division and Ghost Recon, for example, I did actual gameplay footage. This is what the built-in benchmark looks like in these games. Now, the GTX 1060 Division run already finished. That was during the intro speech with all the title cards explaining what the video was. If you missed it or you want to go back and see it, of course, rewind. It's there for you to see the real-time numbers. Now this is the GTX 1070 run, and as you can see, our performance is very good. We're getting about 75 frames per second or so. Now in many previous videos, I've said that I don't like built-in benchmarks because I don't think it represents the actual gameplay. That's still true. I hold by that statement. On the other hand, built-in benchmarks do serve one useful purpose. If you strictly want to know relative performance between two different graphics cards, they can give you an idea in relatively short order how well two different graphics cards will perform in the same game. Not always. There are exceptions. For example, built-in benchmarks usually don't take into account CPU usage or input lag. They don't take into account heavy action on the screen and whether or not the game is responsive. They also generally don't give you an idea of multiplayer performance, usually because of the way they're structured. They're focused more on the single-player experience. Now, benchmark results for each of these will be in slides at the end of the video. Timestamps are in the video description below, so if there's a specific game you're looking for, by all means you can use those timestamps to click around the video. Just click on the time down in the description and it will automatically fast forward the video to the game or to the results that you want to see. Here we are on Rise of the Tomb Raider. We are running at very high detail. I should have noted that The Division, this will all be in the title cards, by the way, for the game performance slides. The Division was in ultra detail. This is in very high. The detail used for each game will be on the benchmark card at the end of each video. So if I don't mention one, it'll be listed there what detail they were running. Notice our performance here on the GTX 1060 is under 60 frames per second. Very high detail in Rise of the Tomb Raider is crushing for performance. My recommendation? Play it on high detail. Very high is nice for screenshots. Very high looks pretty on the back of the box art, although there's really not any retail boxes anymore, but it did at one point. Screenshots, advertising, marketing, promos. If you're just looking at the game, it's gorgeous. When you're playing the game, running around, jumping from ledge to ledge, trying desperately not to fall to your death, high detail is fine, and you'll get a much smoother overall experience. On the other hand, if you want very high, well, that's what the GTX 1070 is for. Notice the pop in of all the vegetation right here. This was not the first run. I ran all of these runs at least 3 times until I got consistent results. Most of them, in this specific case, I ran 5 times back to back. Why? Because that makes sure all of the art assets are loaded. The performance in Rise of the Tomb Raider is actually faster on the first run on that scene because none of the vegetation loads. The run itself runs so quickly that the vegetation simply does not pop into scene, actually causing higher average frame rates for that portion of the test. When you run it a second and a third time, because it's loaded into memory, it then pops in and actually slows it down. This is realistic because if you're actually playing the game in that area, it would have all been loaded up in time, and so you'd see the vegetation. This is why it's important when doing these runs not to just run it once or twice. You got to run it multiple times to make sure everything's loaded into RAM and make sure you're getting consistent, repeatable performance. So most of the time, and in the case of Rise of the Tomb Raider, I actually ran it twice without even bothering to record the numbers, and then I ran it 3 more times, made note of all 3 sets of numbers, and then generally took the middle score of the numbers, although the numbers were very, very close to each other by that point. Notice our frame rate here is substantially better than it was on the GTX 1060. This game loves graphics cards. Notice our CPU usage is quite high. This game also likes CPU power. I have noticed more and more in the past year that I've been testing games are rapidly moving to using up to 8 threads. I've seen it in Ghost Recon Wildlands, The Division, here, Mass Effect Andromeda, Battlefield 1. The days when 4 cores and 4 threads in an i5 are rapidly coming to an end. So if you're thinking about buying a gaming computer, my recommendation is if you want high performance, if you're buying a GTX 1070 or higher, get an i7. Nothing less will do, especially if you want it to have several years of use. Now here we're transitioning to Rainbow Six Siege. Now I've actually played this game and I've tested it in a variety of previous videos where I actually play the multiplayer. To be completely honest, I'm lousy at this game. Some of the game videos I've done on this, while they might show the performance, are probably hard to watch for those of you who are Rainbow Six Siege fans because I'm so bad at it. I've switched to just using the built-in benchmark simply because this isn't my personal cup of tea and I just get frustrated when I do so poorly in the game. The benefit to using the built-in benchmark is it's repeatable. The downside is, does it really reflect the performance of the game? Actually, it might. Rainbow Six Siege is very well optimized and runs on a wide variety of hardware. I was impressed by, even at ultra detail, the high frame rates this game will give, even on relatively modest hardware. And look at this, on a GTX 1060 we're getting almost 140 frames per second. Now it probably won't be that fast in all situations in the game, to be sure. However, you should still get in the 100 frame per second range most of the time, and certainly well above 60 frames per second. On the other hand, are you interested in buying a laptop with a 120Hz G-Sync panel? Yes, those are linked in the description below. With a 120Hz panel, I would recommend a GTX 1070. Why? Take a look at our frame rate. If you really want 120 frames a second, you need a lot of graphics card and a lot of CPU. The i7 7700HQ, the 7th gen version, this is the 6th gen you're watching here, is going to be a little bit faster. And if you want look at that, we're at 170 frames a second. But of course, there's no people present. Built-in benchmark, we're outside. It's not the same thing. If you want 100 plus frames per second in the game, GTX 1070 is where you want to be at. Now, moving on from Rainbow Six Siege, we move to one of my favorite games of 2017, Ghost Recon Wildlands. I have a full live gameplay benchmark of this game between these 2 computers on my channel. Please go check it out. It'll be in the playlist linked down below. The built-in benchmark is fine, but it doesn't necessarily represent the performance of the game actually being played. It's fine for comparison, and a lot of people run it because, of course, it's quick, it's easy. You click B for benchmark, it runs, you record it, you make note of the numbers, and you move on. You don't even have to play the game, and I understand because it's not possible to play every game on the market to the level of detail required to know what good performance is. Now, I've played through a bunch of this game. I'm probably going to finish this game. I tried live streaming it the other day, although I need to set up my live stream setup better to get good performance because I only have an i7 over there, and I really need a Ryzen 7 down there for live streaming. But Ghost Recon Wildlands is incredibly graphical punishing. Here, even in the built-in benchmark, you can see we were below 60 frames per second there at times. I assure you, in the game itself, that's a problem as well. The GTX 1070 is noticeably better. Now, I don't want to rehash all the thermal related issues here because I cover those extensively in the other videos. I will say that if you plan to buy a GTX 1070 laptop, give serious consideration to buying one of the larger, bulkier machines with larger internal fans. The thin and light 4-pound laptops may very well have cooling issues. Look at the temps here just running the built-in benchmark. We're at 80 degrees Celsius, and this is a 6th gen chip, not a 7th. The 7th gen chip is up to 300 megahertz faster, and it will run hotter. Don't be surprised to see temps in thin and light laptops with i7 7700 HQs and GTX 1070s in the 90s. You do run the risk of thermal throttling, and those machines run very, very hot. You really want one of the bigger 7 to 9 pound thick laptops with big fans and big heat pipes to get good temperatures. Now moving on to For Honor. This is not a game that I play. Frankly, it just falls in the category of there's too many games to play and I just have to go with the built-in benchmark. Usual disclaimers apply. Built-in benchmarks do not always represent the actual game performance you will get. First commentary, beautiful game. Look how gorgeous the vegetation, the buildings, the ground, the terrain is. Games are, well, those creatures are kind of ugly, but ignoring that, the terrain, the fire, look at the fire. It looks so realistic. It is beautiful. Maybe I'll give it a try one of these days, but again, the challenge, just too many games, not enough hours in the day. Performance, very respectable. We're on the GTX 1060 here, and we're getting 73, 72 frames per second. Not bad. Does that translate to the game? You'll have to be the judge of that. You'll have to take what you know if you play this game. How well does the built-in benchmark run on your machine? Look how well it's running here, and then scale your actual experience. If you have an older computer and you're playing For Honor and you're getting X performance on your machine, run the built-in benchmark on your computer. Compare your results to the results I get here on these two machines and use that to scale the in-game performance. So for the sake of discussion, let's say that the built-in benchmark is 20 frames per second faster than the actual gameplay that you experience. I don't know if that's the case, but pretend that it is. Fine. Run the built-in benchmark on your machine. If the built-in benchmark on your machine is 20 frames per second slower than this result, then you can expect that the game itself will be about that much faster on here. Now, it may not scale one-to-one. CPU and other factors will affect that. This is the challenge with built-in benchmarks, is how do you scale this? How do you know how playable this really is? Now, having said that, the question may come up, so why are you including this? If you don't like built-in benchmarks and you don't think this represents actual gameplay very well, why is this video being made? Two reasons. Number one, some people like to see it. It's a very quick, simple, easy way to look at 7 different games tested on 2 machines really quickly back to back. Number two, some of these games will simply not get tested otherwise. For Honor, Farcry Primal, Mankind Divided, Rainbow Six Siege, Rise of the Tomb Raider are not getting gameplay tests on these 2 machines. The only 2 in here that I did that on was The Division and Ghost Recon Wildlands. So we've got 5 games here that basically it's take the built-in benchmark or take nothing at all, because there's only so many hours in the day. I've already done a lot of games between these 2 machines. So this is kind of the last video I'll publish that has some extra footage. 2 games I've already tested, 5 that I haven't, and hopefully it's useful to you. And here we are already having moved on to Farcry Primal. This is actually a really short benchmark, but it's beautiful. Look at that world. This is running in ultra detail. Most of the time I end up running Farcry Primal in high detail, but given the power of these 2 machines, I decided to go ahead and crank it up to ultra to see how well these graphics chips could actually handle the game. Or at least, if not the game, at least the built-in benchmark. And as you can see here from the real-time performance numbers, it runs quite nicely. Now I'll show you the minimum, maximum, and average in the charts at the end of this video, just like everything else here. But on the GTX 1060, at least at ultra detail, this is running very, very nicely. The one thing I'll mention are temps. I've mentioned this before, I'll mention it again. This provides a very easy way to see quickly, back to back to back, how the temps are between these 2 laptops. We were in the high 60s on the MSI Apache Pro laptop. Here, we're in the mid-80s. Same CPU, but a faster GPU. But again, the difference is the MSI Apache Pro is a 17.3-inch laptop, a much larger chassis and frame, more room for heat pipes and cooling fans. And of course, the 1060 produces less heat than the 1070. Here, we have a smaller, thinner, lighter laptop that, quite frankly, runs very, very hot. One thing you'll notice is that the GPU usage does not peg at 99% like it did on the 1060. Still, the frame rate is noticeably faster, but as I've said before, if you want to buy a GTX 1070 laptop, my recommendation, get a bigger one, get a thicker one with better cooling. Now finally we come to Mankind Divided. Very high detail. Look at that frame rate. That is, well, let's just say it's a result. 35 frames per second. Granted, built-in benchmark, the real game's going to vary from that, but still, this game continues to be crushing on graphics cards. I have tested the built-in benchmark on this game on a variety of different cards. In order to get truly high frame rates in this benchmark, boy, you need a whole lot more than a GTX 1060, and frankly, even a laptop in order to get top frame rates. If I had more time, if I was completely focused on doing only game tests, one thought that I had is I could take a game such as this, run the built-in benchmark at medium, high, and very high on both of these laptops, put them side by side, back to back, doing the runs next to each other, and then let you see the results that way. But if I did that for all 7 games, first of all, this video would be well north of an hour long, and it would have taken me probably 2 or 3 days just to put together one video. It really doesn't make any sense. All I can tell you is this. This is being tested at very high. If you lower it to high, you'll get closer to 60 frames a second. If you lower it to medium, you'll get over 60 frames a second on the GTX 1060. You'll see the performance on the 1070 in a minute. One key point to keep in mind is that even on a GTX 1060, you're going to find that most games, even through the end of 2017 and into part of 2018, are generally going to play fine at high detail or thereabouts. Sometimes you'll need to make minor changes, turn off shadows, or maybe turn down anti-aliasing or 1 or 2 other features, but you should still be able to get playable frame rates in new AAA games for about the next 18 months or so, just not always at high or very high or ultra detail. That's the benefit of this card right here, the GTX 1070. Look at our performance. This is a solid 20 plus frames per second faster than it was at the beginning of the built-in benchmark run on the 1060. Now our graphics chip is still not running at 99%. Temps, look at that, we're in the 80-degree range. This laptop runs hot. But I'm not suggesting you go out and buy this specific laptop. This is intended to be a review of the GTX 1060 and 1070 graphics chips as they are. These are the 2 machines I have, so that's what I have to test with. I call out the issues where I see them, such as with the temps. Just consider that with a larger, thicker laptop, if you got something like, for example, the MSI Dominator Pro with the GTX 1070, the big 9-pound behemoth with dual cooling fans and big exhausts, you should get cooler temperatures with these chips, even with the 7th gen chip, and thus you should get higher frame rates. Still, even with all the emphasis on that aside, consider that we have basically been above 60 frames per second this entire benchmark run, which we were not on the 1060. So this is a dramatic improvement in performance over the 1060. And really, from a theoretical point of view, the 1070 is about 50% faster than the 1060. Okay, that's enough of all the benchmark tests. Let's take a look at the results. Each game is going to get its own slide in the same order that you watch them in this video. First up, The Division, ultra detail, 55 frames per second average on the 1060, 76 frames per second average on the 1070. That's a nice scaling of performance. The other 2 numbers are a bit different, average GPU usage and average CPU usage. These are provided by the built-in benchmark. Now the graphics chip, the red bars, are kind of irrelevant because it's using all the graphics performance. Look at the average CPU usage. As you go up in graphics performance, you need more CPU performance, 44 to 60% on the CPU total usage. What would my advice be? On the GTX 1070, play at ultra detail, enjoy it. It's beautiful and very smooth. If you have the GTX 1060, set it to high. The graphical differences are minor and the average frame rate will be well over 60 frames a second, and it will lift the minimums as well. This game is much more playable at high on a 1060 than it is at ultra. Moving on to Rise of the Tomb Raider. GTX 1060 has an average frame rate across the three tests of 64 frames per second. The GTX 1070 had an average of 96. This is very, very good scaling, and this demonstrates the true performance difference of these two cards. This is a huge improvement, and if you have the money and you want to future-proof your laptop computer, if you want to be able to play games at high detail for maybe 2 to 3 years instead of 1 to 2, the 1070 is worth the money. You're buying yourself between 12 to 18 months of additional high or very high game performance before you have to start lowering the details or replace your machine. Now, the minimum performance was very close, but that has more to do with the built-in benchmark, so I personally wouldn't worry about that so much. That all happened on the second run. It's like one frame, no big deal. Maximums also show the scaling really well, 108 to 173. What I will tell you is if you have a GTX 1060, this game is very good at high detail. I would not play it at very high. There's too many scenes where the frame rate drops down into the mid-30s and lower 40s at very high on a 1060. But on a 1070, absolutely set it to very high. Enjoy the beautiful game. You should be over 60 frames per second, 99 to 98% of the time. Moving on to Rainbow Six Siege, what an optimized game. Ultra detailed, 1080p, GTX 1060 averaged 118 frames per second with a minimum of 77. Do you need a 1070 to play this game at 60 frames a second? Not even close. In fact, a GTX 1060 would do fine at 120 Hz panel rate for an average, but not the minimum. Look at the GTX 1070. We had 154 average and 94 minimum. So if you buy a laptop with one of the new 120 Hz refresh rate panels and you want to play a competitive online game at 120 frames a second, you definitely want to have the GTX 1070. However, I would still turn the detail down to high to get that minimum up to 120 frames a second. If you're a competitive online gamer, a little bit less detail and more frame rate is where you should be at. Next up, we have Ghost Recon Wildlands. Wait a minute, you say, 56 and 60 frames per second average? What is this? You really need to watch my standalone live gameplay video on this game to understand the results. And then even if you want to, go back and watch it again and watch the temps and watch the graphics card usage. For whatever reason, this game hammers the CPU and hammers the graphics card so hard, temps become an issue. The GTX 1070 is faster than this, and it really should be running faster. In a laptop with better cooling, it would be faster. So, if you want to play Ghost Recon Wildlands at high detail, yes, a GTX 1060 will do it. We had an average of 56 frames per second. It's not going to be quite that good all the time when you're actually playing the game for real, which is why you need to go watch my game performance video, but it is very playable, and I wouldn't have a problem at high detail. If you like super smooth performance, set it to medium, or get a GTX 1070, set it to high detail, and have an awesome experience. Can the 1070 play at very high? Yes, but it gets rough in places. Even on a 1070, I would still play the game at high because it becomes a super smooth, wonderful experience. If you really want to play this game at very high, get a GTX 1080. Expensive, but that's really what it requires for very high detail and super smooth performance. Now next up we have For Honor. Green bars are the average, 71 frames per second on the 1060, 103 frames per second on the 1070. This is very nice scaling, especially because if you watched this whole video, you saw that the 1070 was not always being 100% used, whereas the 1060 was. So this represents a very reasonable result for scaling, even among a 1070 laptop that is not maybe the best for thermal performance, whereas the MSI is a bit better in that regard. Minimums are very close to each other, but I don't worry about minimums and built-in benchmarks too much. They're not long enough, and it only takes a single frame to throw the number down there. Maximums also show nearly 50% scaling, which is in fact the true performance difference between these two cards. Whenever you're doing raw performance comparisons, such as 3D Mark graphical benchmarks, there is about a 50% difference here, so that's represented here in these numbers. Now, again, I don't represent that this is how the actual game will play. It's the built-in benchmark. I haven't played For Honor, but you can use this information to see how well your computer runs compared to these numbers and make your own decision as to whether or not it's worth upgrading. Next up, we have Farcry Primal. Now, the 1070 here is faster, 72 frames per second average versus 61 on the 1060. This 1070 should be faster than this. If you watched the video, you heard my talk and my pointing out of the temps and the fact that the graphics card was not being 100% utilized. Part of that may be simply that the CPU can't keep the graphics card fed. Part of it might be the thermal issues. I do see a larger difference than this on the desktop cards when thermals aren't an issue. I really wish I had a big, large 1070 based laptop such as the Dominator Pro to test these in, but I don't and unfortunately can't afford to buy one. So this is what I have to work with. Usual disclaimers apply. And of course, it's the built-in benchmark and not the game. But hopefully you can compare this to your own results, look at your own GPU and CPU usage and your own temps on whatever computer you have to decide if this is worth upgrading to. Finally, we come to the last result. If you watch this, this makes total sense. 41 frames per second average on the 1060, 66 frames per second average on the 1070. It's nearly perfect scaling, almost 50% faster. Not quite, but it's really darn close. 26 and 48 minimum respective, and then 54 and 87 on the max. Definitely, this is an incredibly graphics card based game. It needs all the graphics card you can throw at it. Now, we're running at very high detail. If you have a 1060, should you play this game at very high? Probably not. You should probably play it at high. It is worth noting in all the recommendations, it's easy to say, well, gee, a 1060 will really play everything today. Do I really need to spend the money for a 1070? No, you don't. But keep in mind that this game didn't come out last week, and many of these games are in fact now a year old. If you're buying a new over $1,000 laptop computer, ask yourself this. Are you okay to already have to start turning down the detail to get playable frame rates at 1080p? Or do you want to buy a laptop where you can crank the details to the max to play at 1080p today, so you can turn it down to high detail in a year and then maybe a medium detail in 2 to 3 years? The 1060, you're really only going to get about 18 months out of that computer before it starts running into performance issues and it'll be time to upgrade. I think you'll get maybe 2.5 years out of the 1070, maybe 3 before that issue becomes the case. So yes, the 1070s cost more, but if you find a good deal or you're okay to spend the money, the 1070 really does have better performance. Again, check those links in the description below. I've linked to multiple laptops, not just one, not just these, so you can decide between thin and light, medium size, and large heavy duty laptops if you want great cooling performance at the expense of size and weight. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with that big huge red button directly below this video. Check the video description for links to everything described in this video, and then please consider supporting me on Patreon. This video was brought to you by my wonderful Patreon supporters. Nothing was provided by any company, no products or sponsorship was provided by anybody mentioned in this video. Thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for supporting, and I will see you in my next video.